Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is Mr. Ballin. Day 8, the forbidden meat. Top 3 strange but true. Click on that thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. There's a thanks button here. You can click on that. Donate if you'd like to. All right, let's get into it.
Today, I'm going to tell 3 strange but true stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and completely rearrange the location of all their apps. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neary Morgan was walking with his 2 younger brothers through a desert in South Australia called Maralinga. Neary and his brothers were members of an isolated Aboriginal tribe called the Martu, and they were out right now to hunt kangaroos for their family. So Neary had a spear, and his 2 younger brothers had a club, and they also had a boomerang. And for a while, they had been tracking this particular group of kangaroos. But every time they slowed down and, the brothers got ready to strike, the kangaroos would take off, and it was very frustrating. But eventually, as they were walking, this group of kangaroos stopped at a watering hole, which was just a few dozen yards away from them. And so at that point, the brothers knew this was their chance. These kangaroos were going to stay here long enough that they could strike. And so Neary signaled to his brothers that it was time to move. And so they got down in the brush and began advancing on the kangaroos. But after only taking a few steps, they heard this loud rumbling sound off in the distance. And as they looked to see what was going on, the sky suddenly was illuminated impossibly bright to the point where Neary is shielding his eyes to just see what's going on here. And as he was doing this extremely hot gust of wind came blasting through and literally knocked the brothers onto the ground, totally disorienting them. And then from the ground, at some point, Neary kind of turns his head and he happens to look in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos were. And then he sees them literally floating in the air, coming right over to him and then dropping on the ground. And then a moment later, it was like everything just went back to normal. The sky went back to a normal color. There was no more rumbling. There was no more wind. Except now, you have all these kangaroos just dead right in front of Neary and his brothers. Now, of course, Neary and his brothers had a lot to process here. I mean, they really had no idea what had happened. But they're looking at this bounty right in front of them, all these kangaroos, and they're thinking, what's just happened here was a gift from God. Clearly, what we just experienced was literally God lifting these kangaroos up, ending their lives, and putting them at our feet. This was a gift. And so eventually, Neary and his brothers, after kind of standing up and dusting themselves off, began lifting up these kangaroos and carrying as many as they could back to their tribe.
Is this an atomic bomb? Did they eat radiated kangaroo?
And then that night, the tribe had this big celebration honoring this gift they had been given from God, and they had this big feast and they ate all this kangaroo meat. I mean, it was incredible. But then the next day, when the tribe woke up, everybody who had eaten any of that kangaroo was violently sick. Vomiting, rashes all over their body, aches, pain. I mean, people were really sick. And over the next few days, some people did recover, but a lot of others did not. And soon, people from this tribe began dying. And so naturally, Neary and the other members of the tribe did make the connection that very likely whatever was happening here, the sickness, was tied to consuming that kangaroo meat. And then other members of the tribe who didn't necessarily subscribe to the idea that, this had been a gift from God, just said clearly the meat was poisoned. But they didn't know if that was intentional, if somebody had done that, or if it was just kind of a byproduct of something else. But poison, that's what was doing this. But for Neary and his tribe, this whole event remained a mystery until 1967, so 11 years later, when Neary was 24 years old. That's when representatives of the British government came out to southern Australia, near where the Martu tribe lived, and began trying to clean up the mess that they had made. It would turn out all those dead kangaroos that got kind of dumped out of the sky right in front of Neary and his brothers were not the result of, God giving them a gift. Instead, the reason that happened was because of a big scientific experiment that was conducted in Maralinga in total secrecy. The British government was testing nuclear bombs. Neary and his brothers had been a few kilometers away from a detonation site, and where they were positioned was basically exactly in the right spot to where they would feel the effects of the explosion, they would hear it, they would see this huge lighting up of the sky, they would feel the shockwave, but they were just far enough away from the detonation site that the shockwave and the blast and all that did not kill them. It knocked them to the ground and made them totally disoriented and confused, and I'm sure it hurt a great deal. But it didn't kill them. However, those kangaroos they had been stalking were technically closer to the detonation site. They were also smaller and so were more susceptible to an explosion being affected by it. And so they were just close enough that when that shockwave passed through, it lifted up and obliterated the kangaroos and threw them right in front of Neary. They were like right at that perfect separation point. Neary and brothers just barely safe, kangaroos just barely in the lethal zone. And so keep in mind that Neary and his brothers did not know things like nuclear bombs existed. They're very isolated. They're completely cut off from sort of modern society. And so even though they saw a lot of indications that this was a bomb, they didn't really interpret it that way. Instead, they interpreted this as, oh, God has bestowed upon me this bounty. Like this is a gift from God. But in reality, it was just this explosion, and the meat, the kangaroo meat, was not only devastated from the blast, but it was also littered with radiation from the blast. And so the members of the tribe who ate the kangaroo meat immediately got radiation sickness and began to die. An unknown number of people died from these nuclear bomb tests, and it would take 11 years before the British government would come in and begin cleaning up the nuclear waste. The Australian government ultimately paid $13.5 million in compensation to Aboriginal tribes that were affected by these tests. As for Neary, he survived.
What are they going to do with that money? I mean, it's nice, but what are they going to do with that money? I don't really know what Aboriginal tribes. I figured that they would. Did I say tribe? I figure that they would be, they're not going to buy their food. So I don't know what the money's going to do for them. It's a nice gesture.
And today, he's actually in his 80s, and he continues to tell his story to younger generations. You know the feeling you get when you're listening to a story how say history in a way. The grip audibleness except provoke is a seat for a free At 4 p.m. on Saturday, October 26, 2019, a 56-year-old woman named Pamela Krymeyer was hanging out in her son's backyard in Knoxville, Iowa. She was there with her son and his wife, who was expecting a child, along with some other relatives. And they were there that day in the backyard to have a gender reveal party. And Pamela could not have been more excited. So during the week, Pamela worked full-time as an assistant at a U.S. Army base nearby. But to her, that was just a job. That was not like her identity. Where Pamela really put all her energy was her family. I mean, she really identified not as somebody who worked at that army base, but rather as a mom and a wife and a grandmother. And she was so excited to find out if her new grandchild was going to be a boy or a girl. And so after a little while, Pamela's son finally signaled to the group that it was time to get started. And so Pamela and the other relatives got really excited and they backed up towards the fence on the side of the yard, and Pamela pulled out her phone to film this because she wanted to make sure she saved this moment for future generations. I mean, this was a pivotal moment in her family's history. And so all excited, Pamela's filming, and Pamela's son and his pregnant wife walked towards the middle of the yard where there was this device that was set up that was basically going to reveal whether it was a boy or a girl. Blue for boy and pink for girl. There was going to be some dust kind of shot out into the air. And so Pamela's son turns to the crowd and says, "Okay, you guys ready?" And Pamela's really excited. She gives a thumbs up and she's filming. And then Pamela's son turns away from the crowd and he kind of leans over this device. He does something to it. And then he and his wife backed up along the fence line with the other relatives. And everybody watched and filmed, waiting to see if this device was going to spit out blue or pink. But before anybody could see any color, there was this deafening booming sound. And then for Pamela, everything went black. A split second later, the backyard was absolute chaos as people screamed and called out to call 911. It would turn out the device in the middle of the backyard that was going to be used to reveal whether the baby was a boy or a girl was a homemade device. Basically, it was like the cylinder that Pamela and her son and family had made that basically would fire off either pink or blue powder. Except the tube that the powder sat inside of was metal, and then what they were using to basically shoot the powder out was gunpowder. So they basically packed gunpowder into a metal tube, sealed it off, and then attached a fuse to the gunpowder. And so when Pamela's son went and lit the fuse, as he leaned over and lit the fuse and said, okay, we're gonna see what it spits out, he had lit, effectively, a pipe bomb. And then when the fuse ignited the gunpowder, the metal tubing exploded and sent shards of metal up to 400 feet away. And one particular piece of metal shard went right at Pamela and into her head. When first responders showed up in the backyard, they saw a scene that was absolute chaos. Holes in the fence, holes in the house, metal everywhere, and Pamela lying up against the fence on the ground, dead. Amazingly, despite the shrapnel being blasted out all over the neighborhood and in close proximity to other people in the backyard, Pamela was the only fatality. And because it was ultimately ruled an accident, no one faced criminal charges.
That sucks. As soon as I heard metal tube, I was like, oh. Oh no.
On the morning of October 30th, 2014, a 54-year-old Russian pilot named Sergei Galitsky, along with his translator, walked into the Flight Safety International building in Wichita, Kansas. This building was inside of the Wichita National Airport, and it was basically just a big training facility for pilots. Once inside, Sergei walked up to the front desk and explained to the clerk in Russian that he was here that day to try to get a certification for a particular type of Cessna plane. His translator then repeated what he said in English to the clerk, at which point the clerk nodded and said they would go back and get Sergei's instructor. A few moments later, the clerk returned, now with a 78-year-old man named Jay Ferguson, who was the instructor. Jay introduced himself to Sergei and the translator, they all shook hands, and then Jay led the two deeper into the building. And as soon as they were inside, Sergei and the translator saw all this crazy high-tech training equipment basically everywhere they looked. Eventually, Jay came to a stop in front of this big, white, circular pod that was up on top of this electronic base. Now, to the untrained eye, this might look like a futuristic amusement park ride, but to Sergei, he knew what this was. This was a flight simulator. So Sergei had been a pilot for over 30 years. He had loads of experience flying. He had flown big commercial aircraft and helicopters. But today, he was learning how to fly a sort of mid-tier plane, this little Cessna plane. And before he'd be allowed, even with all his experience, to actually go out and fly this thing, he had to do a couple of simulated flights inside of the simulator to kind of run through the motions, get some experience before actually going out and doing it. And so Jay reached out and opened up the door to this pod and gestured for Sergei and the translator to go inside. And so they did. Sergei went in, and he saw right away that the inside was an exact replica of the inside of a Cessna, like down to every little detail. It looked exactly the same. Even out the windows, it appeared like they actually were situated on a real airport runway. And so Sergei sat down in the pilot's seat, Jay took a seat next to him, and the translator took a seat behind both of them. Once they were situated, Jay and Sergei went through the mandatory pre-flight safety checks, something you would do on any flight. You just make sure the plane is in good working order, that your communications are good. Same thing they would do for a real flight, they're doing for this simulator. And then once they were done, Jay pressed a button which turned on the engine of this flight simulator. And it actually felt like it really turned on a real engine, like the pod began to rumble, like this was a real plane. Then, once Jay gave...
That sounds so cool, but why do I feel like this is not going to end well? How does this end wrong? It's a simulator. Does the simulator suddenly start flying? And they're like, oh no, we didn't mean to hit that button. I'm going to click the button, but I'm trying to figure out how this ends terribly. It locks and catches on fire. I have no idea.
Sergei the green light, Sergei released the brakes, at which point it very much appeared like the plane began to roll forward. And as it did, Sergei grabbed the yoke, which is like the steering wheel, and he began to turn the plane, this simulated plane, towards the runway. And it was amazing how lifelike this whole thing felt. The pod actually would move and kind of keep up with all the movements that Sergei was initiating in this simulation. It really felt like they were in an actual plane. And then, once Sergei had positioned the plane on the runway, he hit the gas, and the pod throttled back as the plane rocketed down the runway, and before long they took off and they were up into the sky. Once flying in the sky, Sergei kind of circled around the digital airspace for a while, kind of feeling out the controls, and he quickly found the Cessna was a little bit more sensitive than the other aircrafts he had flown before. So it took some time to kind of get his bearings, and then once he was feeling pretty comfortable, and he relayed as much to Jay began relaying directions and feedback to Sergei through the translator, just basically testing Sergei's ability to fly this craft. Because at the end of the day, this was a test. Sergei needed to prove he could do this in order to get his certification. After a little while, Sergei felt like he was doing a really good job and he had good control of the craft, and Jay as well felt like this had gone really well and, Sergei had effectively passed his test. And so a decision was made to go ahead and land this plane back on the runway. So Sergei circled around and he angled the plane right alongside the runway, and he came down and he was taking his time and everything was going exactly right. And then right as the wheels of this plane touched the runway, the instant that happened, there was this loud crashing sound, and then everything went black. At the same time this was happening, folks standing outside of the Flight Safety International building, they heard this loud crashing sound, and they looked in the direction, which is toward the Flight Safety building, and they saw there was this massive fire and black cloud of smoke coming up from the backside of the building. And so they called 911. And when first responders arrived on scene, they discovered evidence of a plane crash. It would turn out there was another pilot named Mark Goldstein who was flying that day out of Wichita National Airport. Except Mark was flying an actual plane. He was the only passenger inside of a 6-seat passenger plane. And pretty much as soon as he took off, he lost control and he crashed through the walls of the Flight Safety International building. Specifically, he struck the flight simulator where Jay, Sergei, and his translator were busy trying to land their digital flight. The plane crash, along with subsequent fiery explosion, claimed the lives of Mark, Jay, Sergei, and his translator.
Oh, that's terrible. Oh. Poor people. Oh, man. Okay. Well, that didn't turn out the way I was thinking it would. I figured something horrific would happen. I just didn't expect that. I thought maybe the machine would lock up, something would happen, and then it catches fire and they couldn't get them out. That's terrible, too. All right. Well, I'm going to end it here. So until next time, don't go to flight simulators. But also have a good day, have a good night.